8 News Now investigators, the Valley home searched in connection to the Tupac Shakur murder investigation.
If you was to get shot 5 times, mine is just completely spinning, you know what I'm saying? You're real confused about your situation. That's a strong dude, yo. I know Duke, you know what I'm saying? He's real strong. So when it was like he got shot, I was just more like, again? You know what I'm saying? He always getting shot or shot at. He gonna pull through this one again.
They didn't want you to know this part of the story. They didn't want you to know what really happened the night everything changed, or how 2 young men became pawns in a game far bigger, darker, and more profitable than anyone realized. They wanted a neat little legend, 2 rappers, 2 coasts, 1 deadly rivalry. But the truth, the real truth, was never meant to see daylight. Before the headlines, before the diss tracks, before the world was told to pick sides, Tupac Shakur and the notorious B.I.G. weren't enemies. They weren't rivals. They weren't symbols of 2 warring coasts. They were just artists, hungry, ambitious, and rising fast, trying to survive an industry that pretended to celebrate them, while quietly engineering both their destruction and their legend. In the early 1990s, Tupac was already becoming a voice that cut through the noise, loud, angry, emotional, political, unpredictable, magnetic. Biggie was the opposite, calm, composed, surgical with his words. Tupac embraced him instantly. He saw talent, he saw hunger, and he respected it. There was no rivalry then, only admiration. Tupac invited Biggie to shows. They shared stages, they shared meals. Tupac even let Biggie crash at his house when he needed a place. This wasn't the beginning of a feud. It was the beginning of a brotherhood. But behind that brotherhood, something else was happening. Something the fans never saw. The music industry was changing. Labels were merging. Corporations were investing. And suddenly rap wasn't just art. It was a product. Conflict sold records. Rivalry created headlines. Drama brought profit. And that's where the manipulation quietly began. This wasn't just East versus West because artists wanted it that way. It was East versus West because powerful people realized there was money in blood, money in tension, money in feeding the flames faster than they could be put out. Everything changed in 1994. Tupac walked into Quad Studios in Manhattan expecting to record music. Nothing more. What happened instead became the ignition point for one of the darkest chapters in hip-hop history. The ambush inside the lobby, the sudden gunshots, the quick movements of masked men, the confusion, the chaos. Tupac survived, but something inside him didn't. As Tupac lay wounded, one question burned hotter than the pain. Who knew? Who had information? Who stayed silent? Who watched the betrayal happen in real time? People he trusted were upstairs. People he considered friends. Biggie, Junior Mafia, industry figures he recognized. They denied involvement, but denial wasn't the same as clarity. It wasn't the same as truth. That night became the fracture line, a single event that turned friendship into suspicion, suspicion into paranoia, and paranoia into an industry-wide wildfire. The press pounced instantly. Headlines sharpened, narratives twisted. Interviews were edited, chopped, and packaged to amplify tension. What should have been a private conflict became public entertainment, and behind the scenes, executives watched the numbers climb, magazines sold faster, radio ratings jumped, labels profited. They didn't see 2 human beings, they saw revenue streams. Tupac's world changed even more once he aligned with Death Row Records. The environment wasn't peaceful, it wasn't calm, it was fuel, raw, unfiltered fuel, feeding every spark of anger he carried. The people around him didn't want de-escalation. They wanted dominance, victory, reaction. The more Tupac fought, the more valuable he became. Biggie, meanwhile, was being pulled by forces he never openly acknowledged. His label wanted him to stand firm. Fans expected responses. The East Coast needed a champion. Biggie wasn't naturally confrontational, but silence wasn't an option anymore. Not when millions were listening for every word he spoke. The spiral began. Diss tracks weren't just music anymore. They were battlefields. They were coded messages. They were headlines waiting to erupt. And every time Tupac or Biggie tried to step back, the world pushed them forward again. They were trapped inside roles they didn't ask for, roles created by executives, journalists, managers, and the audiences cheering for more fire. Then came the moment nobody talks about enough. The Las Vegas surveillance tapes, never publicly released in full, became one of the most whispered about mysteries in hip-hop. Those hours of footage captured far more movement, far more faces, and far more details than the public was ever shown. In private circles, people talked about the identities seen lingering near the MGM lobby. They talked about who followed whose entourage. They talked about how many unexplained individuals appeared in frame, people with no connection to either artist. What actually happened in those hours remains one of the industry's most carefully managed secrets, and that secrecy tells its own story. As the tension escalated, reality and performance fused into something dangerous, irreversible, and predatory. Every rumor became a weapon, every lyric became a threat, every interview became evidence in a conflict neither artist fully controlled. The industry didn't produce music during those years, they produced warfare. By 1996, Tupac's world was a storm spiraling around him faster than he could navigate. Every day brought new threats, new warnings, new reasons to be on edge. The night he was shot in Las Vegas wasn't random. It wasn't spontaneous. Something had been building toward that moment for months, maybe years. When Tupac died, the world mourned. The industry panicked, but only temporarily, because months later, Biggie walked straight into his own trap. Los Angeles, March 1997. A crowded party, a familiar atmosphere, cars trailing his SUV, a final intersection. A window rolls down. One motion, one decision, one bullet pattern that ended everything. The symmetry was impossible to ignore. The timing was too sharp. The parallels were too clean. 2 murders, 2 coasts, 2 artists, and 0 closure. Investigations dragged on. Fingers pointed everywhere except where they needed to. Witnesses stayed silent. Evidence disappeared. Files were sealed. Careers continued. Money flowed. And the rivalry? It became mythology. A legend polished, monetized, repackaged, and sold again and again. Even today, the question lingers like a shadow. How much of the feud was real, and how much was engineered? Because the more you study the timeline, the clearer one thing becomes. The biggest winners of the East-West War were never Tupac and Biggie. The biggest winners were the people who profited from keeping them divided. Tupac was an artist who spoke about oppression, politics, pain, and revolution. Biggie was a storyteller with unmatched flow and charisma. Together, they could have created something historic, an alliance powerful enough to shift the entire culture. And maybe that's the real reason they were never allowed to repair what broke. Imagine a world where the quad shooting didn't happen. Imagine a world where media didn't twist every quote. Imagine a world where labels didn't push conflict as marketing. Imagine a world where these 2 icons collaborated instead of being turned into soldiers for a war they didn't start. That world never happened, maybe because too many forces ensured it couldn't. Their legacy today? Beautiful, legendary, eternal, but fractured, distorted, shaped by the very machine that benefited from their downfall. This wasn't just a tragedy of 2 lives lost. It was a demonstration of how an industry can create a narrative so powerful that even truth gets buried beneath it. And the darkest part? The same system still exists. The same incentives still exist. And modern artists are still being pushed toward the same traps, just with brighter lights and bigger numbers. If you've read this far, you already feel it. That pressure, that tension, that undercurrent beneath the official story. You already know the truth was never simple, never clean, never fully told. And now you have to ask yourself, did we lose Tupac and Biggie to a feud, or to an industry that needed their conflict more than their survival? Because that question, the one no one wants to answer, is the one that still haunts hip-hop to this day. Their voices were silenced, their story was sold, and the people responsible, still collecting royalties. Now it's your turn. Who do you think orchestrated the East-West divide? Was it the labels, the media, or someone even closer to the artists? And if Tupac and Biggie had been allowed to unite, how would hip-hop history have changed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your theories. The truth may be buried, but your voice can keep the conversation alive. Subscribe to Nyx Narratives, because what they told you was never the full story,